The station called Athenaeum Prime floated in the cold dark between empires, circling a dead star that had burned out long before any species in the galactic concord had learned to walk upright. Ambassador Tivek Shoran of the Valesi stood at the observation window and watched two fleets hang in the void like knives pointed at each other's throats. On one side, the Drakari Dominion, 100 warships built from black iron and fury, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a moon in half. And on the other side, the Yith Collective, a swarm of pale organic vessels that moved like a single living thing, breathing and pulsing in the silence of space. Tivek pressed his long mantis-like fingers together, and felt the weight of 800 years of fragile peace sitting on his narrow shoulders. He had been a mediator for 40 years, and in that time he had settled border disputes and trade conflicts, and even one incident involving a misunderstood mating ritual between two amphibian species, but this was different. This was the one that could break everything. The Drakari wanted blood because the Yith had expanded into 3 systems the Drakari considered sacred hunting grounds, and the Yith wanted territory because that was simply what the Yith did. They grew and spread and consumed, not out of malice, but out of biological need, the way a lung needs air. Neither side was wrong and neither side was right, and that made the whole thing infinitely harder. Tivek had requested a full security detachment from the Concord High Council, at least 30 armed peacekeepers from the Valoran Guard, soldiers trained specifically for volatile diplomatic situations. Instead, he received a single message that read, "Security attaché assigned from Unite Terran Commonwealth, Captain Marin Voss, arriving 0600 station time. 1 human." They sent him 1 human. Tivek had stared at the message for a very long time before. Closing it and pouring himself a drink, he did not normally allow himself during working hours. He knew about humans the way most Valesi knew about humans, in the abstract, in the general, in the way one knows about a small country on the far side of a continent one has never visited. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord roughly 200 years ago, which in galactic terms made them practically newborns, still wet and blinking in the light of a universe that had been conducting business for millennia without them. They were clever, everyone agreed on that, and they were adaptable in a way that some xenobiologists found almost suspicious. But they were not impressive in the ways that mattered at a summit like this. They were not 8 feet tall like the Drakari, whose warriors could bend starship plating with their bare claws. They were not numerous like the Yith, who could field 1 billion drones from a single hive node without blinking their compound eyes. Humans were soft and medium-sized and breakable, and they smiled too much. And they had a strange habit of forming emotional attachments to everything around them, including machines and animals, and sometimes even furniture. They were, in Tivek's private assessment, a species that had gotten lucky with their engineering skills and their willingness to trade with absolutely anyone. And that was the beginning and the end of what made them useful. Captain Marin Voss arrived at exactly 0600, and she was everything Tivek had expected and feared. She was average height for a human female, with dark hair pulled back tight and brown skin that carried a few scars she made no effort to hide. And she wore a standard Terran military uniform that looked almost deliberately plain next to the gleaming armor of the Drakari or the bioluminescent carapace of the Ith. She carried a sidearm on her hip and a combat knife on her belt, and nothing else, she said, extending her hand in the human greeting gesture. "Captain Marin Voss, Terran Diplomatic Security, reporting for duty." Her grip was firm but careful, the way one holds something fragile, and Tivek noticed that she adjusted her pressure the moment she touched his chitinous fingers, calibrating instantly to his species' bone density. It was such a small thing that he almost missed it. "Captain Voss," he said, keeping his voice perfectly neutral, in the way only a Valesi could, "I must be candid with you. I requested a full security team, and I received you. and while I intend no disrespect to the Terran Commonwealth, I am struggling to understand how one individual is supposed to secure a station hosting 2 hostile delegations with war fleets parked outside. She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that showed teeth without any aggression behind it, which Tivik found deeply confusing because among most species, showing teeth meant something very different. I understand your concern, Ambassador, and I want you to know that I take this assignment very seriously. The Commonwealth considers this summit a top priority. That is reassuring in theory, Tivik said, but theory will not stop a Drakari warlord from tearing this station apart if negotiations fail. No, sir, she agreed pleasantly. Theory won't. She did not elaborate on what would, and Tivik found that omission strangely irritating. The delegations arrived within hours of each other, which was itself a power play. Neither side willing to be the first to board the station and appear eager. Warlord Krothar of the Drakari came first, despite losing that particular game of pride, striding through the docking bay like a siege engine made of scales and fury. 9 feet of armored reptilian muscle, with a jaw that could crush stone and eyes that burned like molten copper. His honor guard flanked him, 6 warriors in full ceremonial battle plate, each one carrying enough weaponry to fight a small war independently. Krothar stopped when he saw Marin, and looked down at her the way a mountain looks down at a pebble. "This is the security?" he rumbled, his voice like gravel being crushed. "One soft little mammal with a knife." "And a gun," Marin said cheerfully. "Don't forget the gun." Several of the Drakari guards made a sound that Tyvik's translator struggled with, before settling on contemptuous amusement. Krothar snorted hot air from his nostrils, and moved on without another word, dismissing her from his attention the way one dismisses an insect that is too small to bother swatting. The Yith emissary arrived next, a single drone body controlled remotely by the Overmind, pale and thin and clicking softly as it walked on 4 segmented legs, its faceted eyes reflecting everything and revealing nothing. It passed Marin without acknowledgement, as though she simply did not exist. Register as relevant data. Tivik watched Marin's face during both encounters and saw something that puzzled him. She was not offended, and she was not afraid, and she was not performing bravery the way young soldiers sometimes did when they wanted to look tough in front of superior species. She was calm the way water is calm, still on the surface, with no indication of what moved beneath. That night, after the first round of negotiations had gone exactly as badly as Tivik had feared, with both sides posturing and threatening and making demands they knew would be rejected, Marin asked to speak with him privately. "Ambassador," she said, and her voice had changed. The cheerfulness was gone, and something sharper had taken its place. "I have been reviewing the fleet positions outside the station, using the sensor data from the maintenance systems." "That data is restricted," Tivik said. "Yes, sir, it was," she agreed without apology. "That both fleets have repositioned over the last 6 hours into overlapping firing arcs centered on this station." Tivik felt his blood cool in the way it did when his species sensed danger. A biological response, older than language. "What are you suggesting, Captain?" Marin looked at him with those brown human eyes that suddenly seemed much older than the rest of her face. "I am suggesting that this is not a negotiation, Ambassador. This is a kill box, and we are standing in the middle of it." He sat in his quarters and stared at the sensor data Marin had pulled from the maintenance systems, and tried to find a way to tell himself she was wrong. But the numbers did not lie, and the geometry was unmistakable. Both fleets had shifted into what human military doctrine apparently called a convergence pattern. Overlapping fields of fire that turned the empty space around Athenium Prime into a killing ground. And the station was sitting right at the center of it, like a fruit waiting to be crushed between 2 closing fists. If either fleet opened fire, the station would be destroyed within minutes, and every soul aboard, diplomats, guards, staff, and one quietly terrifying human captain, would be vapor before anyone could send a distress signal. The elegance of the trap was what made Tivek's blood run cold. Whoever had arranged this had done so knowing that both the Drakari and the wife would blame each other for the destruction of a Concord diplomatic station, and in the chaos that followed, the war both sides secretly wanted would become inevitable, and no one would look too closely at how it started. "We need to contact the High Council," Tivek said when Marin came to his quarters at dawn. "Communications are jammed," she said, settling into a chair across from him with a cup of something hot and brown that humans called coffee. "Officially, it is being attributed to solar radiation from the dead star, but the jamming pattern is artificial. Someone on this station is running a signal suppressor." "Who?" "I do not know yet," she said, and then she took a sip of her coffee and added, "But I will." Over the next 2 days, while Tivek conducted negotiations that he now understood were nothing more than theater performed for an audience that wanted them to fail, Marin did something that baffled him completely. She socialized. She spent the first evening drinking with the Drakari honor guard in the station's common area, matching them cup for cup of a fermented Drakari spirit that Tivek knew for a fact could strip paint from metal. And she did not flinch, and she did not vomit, and she traded stories with them about battles and hunts and the kinds of near-death experiences that warriors apparently bonded over the way normal people bonded over shared meals. The Drakari guards still thought she was a joke, but they were the kind of warriors who respected anyone willing to drink their poison and survive. And by the end of the night, they were calling her Little Fang in their language, which was an insult wrapped around a grudging acknowledgement. The next morning she sat in silence with the Yith drones in the secondary hall where they gathered between sessions, not speaking, not moving, just watching them with patient, focused attention the way a scientist watches an experiment. The Yith drones clicked and shifted and seemed to forget she was there. Learned that Marin had spent 3 hours memorizing their movement patterns and communication rhythms, and the subtle ways their formation changed when the emissary's drone body entered the room versus when it was absent. She also spent time with the station's maintenance crew, the low-ranking technicians and cooks and janitors that every delegation ignored because they were beneath notice, and she learned their names and asked about their families and helped one of them fix a broken water recycler in the lower deck, and in return, they told her things. They told her about the unmarked cargo containers that had arrived 2 weeks before the summit and been stored in a sealed section of the lower decks. They told her about the 3 crew members who had been transferred to the station a month ago and who kept to themselves and never ate in the common mess, and whose identification codes did not match any known Concord personnel database. Strange signals that pulsed through the station's internal network at odd hours, signals that the chief engineer had flagged and been told to ignore by station administration. Tivek did not learn any of this until Marin sat him down on the second evening and laid it all out in front of him, like a surgeon opening up a patient to show the disease inside. "There are mercenaries aboard this station," she said, her voice flat and precise. "At least 10, possibly more, smuggled in through the maintenance supply chain and hidden in the lower decks. They are Golkari, based on the biosignatures the maintenance sensors have picked up." Tivek felt something inside his chest tighten, because he knew what the Golkari were, a blacklisted species of bio-augmented killers who had been expelled from the Concord decades ago for conducting unsanctioned genetic warfare, and who now sold their services to anyone willing to pay enough and look the other way. Almost certainly to attack during the negotiations and kill everyone aboard, Marin continued. The destruction will be blamed on the Drakari and Yith killing each other. The jammed communications will prevent any distress call, and by the time the Concord figures out what actually happened, both fleets outside will already be at war. "How do you know their exact mission?" Tivek asked. Because it is what I would do, Marin said simply, if I wanted to start a war and make it look like someone else's fault. That answer unsettled Tivek in a way he could not fully articulate. She continued her briefing and told him 2 more things she had discovered. First, Warlord Krothar's daughter, Sub-Commander Ishka, was not aligned with the war faction in the Drakari delegation. She was a reformist who believed the Dominion's future lay in diplomacy rather than conquest, and she had been trying to reach her father through the wall of pride and tradition and rage that surrounded him like armor thicker than anything he wore on his body. Marin had identified Ishka during the drinking session, when the sub-commander had quietly steered the conversation away from war stories and toward questions about how other species resolve disputes without bloodshed. And the look in her reptilian eyes had been hungry in a way that had nothing to do with violence. Second, the Yith emissary's drone body was behaving inconsistently. Moments of independence and initiative that should have been impossible for a body controlled by the Overmind, which suggested that the connection to the true Overmind had been compromised. And a rogue hive node was feeding the emissary instructions designed to sabotage the negotiations from the Yith side. Someone had planned this from every angle. "What do we do?" Tivek asked, and he was aware that he was asking a human, a species he had dismissed as minor and unremarkable 48 hours ago, for guidance on how to survive a conspiracy that could shatter galactic civilization. "We prepare," Marin said. And she began to prepare in ways that Tivek only understood later. She moved furniture in the main negotiation hall, shifting the heavy conference table 2 meters to the left and angling the decorated screens along the wall, and repositioning the chairs in a pattern that seemed random until you understood, as Tivek eventually did, that she was creating lanes of fire and points of cover and choke points that would funnel attackers into kill zones. She asked the maintenance crew to reroute power to the emergency lighting system and to leave specific access panels unlocked along the corridors leading to the hall. She had a quiet conversation with Sub-Commander Ishka that lasted 20 minutes and ended with the massive Drakari warrior staring at the small human woman with an expression that Tivek's cultural database could not translate. Something between disbelief and the first fragile shoots of something that might have been hope. On the 3rd morning, as the delegations filed into the hall for what both sides clearly intended to be the final session of a failed summit, the station's lights flickered once and then went dark. Emergency lighting kicked in, painting everything in deep red, and somewhere in the lower decks a sound began, a rhythmic booming like a heartbeat made of metal and violence. Marin stood from her chair, in the corner, where she had been sitting so quietly that most of the delegates had forgotten she existed. She rolled her neck, once to the left and once to the right, and Tivek heard something in her spine click, with a sound like a round being chambered. "It is starting," she said, and her voice was calm the way the center of a hurricane is calm, still and quiet, because everything dangerous was spinning around it. "Stay behind me, Ambassador. No matter what you see, stay behind me." The first explosion ripped through the lower decks and sent a shudder through the entire station like a giant animal flinching from a wound. The second explosion blew the main doors of the negotiation hall inward and filled the air with smoke and shrapnel and the screaming of metal being torn apart. Through the ruined doorway they came, the Golkari, 12 of them, and Tivek understood immediately why they had been blacklisted from the Concord. They were nightmares, made of flesh and engineering. Each one stood 7 feet tall, their bodies wrapped in grafted bone plate that grew from their skin like armor that was part of them, fused to muscle and tendon in ways that made them walking siege weapons. And they carried plasma cutters that glowed white-hot, and nerve disruptors that hummed with a frequency Tivek could feel in his teeth. Their eyes were dead, not cruel, not angry, just empty, the way a tool is empty. Precision of machines designed for one purpose, killing everything in the room. The Drakari Honor Guard reacted first, because that was what Drakari did. They roared and drew their weapons and charged headlong into the enemy, because retreat was a concept their species had never fully learned to accept. 3 of them went down in the first 4 seconds. The lead Golkari caught the first Drakari warrior's charge and turned it aside with a bone-plated forearm, then drove a plasma cutter through the warrior's chestplate like it was paper, and the other 2 fell to nerve disruptors that overloaded their nervous systems and dropped them twitching and convulsing to the floor. The Yith drones swarmed next, 6 of them launching from the walls in a coordinated burst that should have overwhelmed a single target through sheer numbers. But the Golkari had been designed to fight swarms, and their nerve disruptors pulsed in a wide arc that hit the drones' hive link frequency and fried their coordination, turning a deadly formation into a pile of clicking, scrambling, disconnected bodies. Krothar grabbed his daughter and pulled her behind the conference table, his massive body shielding hers, and for the first time since Tivik had met the warlord, he saw fear in those molten copper eyes. Not fear of death, but fear that there was nothing he could do. The delegates screamed and scrambled and fell over each other, trying to find cover that did not exist. Tivik stood frozen in the red light, with the smoke burning his eyes and the sound of violence filling his head, and he thought with terrible clarity that this was how the Concord would die. Not in a great war between fleets, but in a small, ugly room on a forgotten station, murdered by mercenaries in the dark. And then Marin Voss moved. She moved the way water moves when a dam breaks, sudden and total and impossible to stop. The first Golkari did not see her coming because it was focused on the Drakari it was killing, and Marin came at it from its blind side, low and fast, and she fired her sidearm twice into the gap between its bone-plated shoulder and its neck. And the shots were so precise that the creature's arm went limp, and the plasma cutter clattered to the floor. And before it could turn, she was already past it, already moving to the next one. The second Golkari swung a plasma cutter at her head, and she dropped beneath it so fast that Tivik's eyes could not track the motion. One moment she was standing, and the next she was below the arc of the blade, and driving her shoulder into the creature's midsection, and using its own forward momentum to throw it sideways into the third Golkari, tangling them together for the 2 seconds she needed to put a round into each of their knee joints. They did not die from that, but they fell, and falling against Marin Voss was a death sentence with a delayed fuse, and something inside his understanding of the universe shifted like a tectonic plate moving beneath his feet. She did not fight like the Drakari. There was no rage in her, no bellowing, no headlong charge into the teeth of the enemy. She did not fight like the Yith. There was no swarm logic, no coordinated pattern, no hive-mind precision. She fought like something else entirely, something Tivik had no framework for, no category, no evolutionary precedent in his species' long and careful history of avoiding conflict. She fought like a creature that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning how to kill things bigger and stronger and faster than itself, and had gotten so terrifyingly good at it that it had become the thing that everything else was afraid of. The furniture she had rearranged 2 days ago suddenly made sense. The heavy table was a barricade. The decorative screens were cover positions. The repositioned chairs created narrow lanes that forced the Golkari to come at her in ones and twos instead of all at once. She had turned the negotiation hall into a killing ground, and she had done it with a smile and a polite request to the maintenance staff 3 days before anyone started shooting. The fourth Golkari rushed her, and she grabbed the edge of a decorative light fixture and ripped it from the wall and smashed it across the creature's face. The burst of sparks and glass blinded it long enough for her to put her knife into the soft tissue beneath its jaw, driving the blade upward with a motion that was both surgical and savage. Tivik saw the knife go in, and saw the creature shudder and fall, and saw Marin pull the blade free with a twist that spoke of practice. Not the practice of training rooms and simulations, but the deep muscle memory of someone who had done this before, in places where it counted. The fifth and sixth came at her together, and one of them caught her with a plasma cutter across her left shoulder, and Tyvek saw skin and muscle part, and saw bone gleam white in the red emergency light. And he expected her to scream, or fall, or at least slow down. She did none of those things. She shifted her weight to compensate for the damaged arm, and changed her fighting style in the space between one heartbeat and the next, switching her knife to her right hand, and adjusting her stance, and continuing to move as though the wound was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, an accounting error in the mathematics of violence. A nerve disruptor hit her in the back, and she staggered, her body locking up for a fraction of a second as the pulse scrambled her nervous system. And then she forced herself through it with what Tyvek could only describe as an act of pure biological stubbornness, her muscles seizing and then releasing as her body fought the disruption and won through nothing more than the refusal to stop. The surviving Drakari honor guard had stopped fighting. They were watching her. Krothar was watching her from behind the overturned table, with his daughter pressed against his chest, and his ancient warrior's eyes were wide with something that Tyvek had never seen on a Drakari face before, something that went beyond surprise into a territory that bordered on the religious. Marin killed the seventh with her sidearm, and the eighth with her knife, and the ninth by driving it headfirst into a structural support column with enough force to crack the bone plating on its skull. Her sidearm ran empty somewhere around the 10th, and she dropped it without hesitation and took the knife in both hands, her left arm bleeding freely, her back still twitching from the nerve disruptor hit. And she went at the remaining 3 Golkari with nothing but a blade and her teeth bared in an expression that was not a smile and not a snarl, but something in between, something primal, something that came from a place inside. The human species that civilization had buried, but never managed to kill. She was covered in blood, most of it dark Golkari ichor, some of it her own bright human red, and she was breathing hard, and her eyes were focused with an intensity that made the air around her feel like it was vibrating. The last 3 Golkari hesitated. They were engineered killing machines, bio-augmented predators designed to be afraid of nothing, and they hesitated because the small, soft, medium-sized human woman standing in front of them had just killed 9 of their kind in under 3 minutes, and she was still standing, and she was still coming. She killed them anyway. When it was over, when the 12th body hit the floor, and the hall was silent except for the hiss of damaged wiring and the distant groan of the station's wounded superstructure, Marin stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the dead. She was swaying slightly, and her shoulder wound was bad, and her breathing came in ragged pulls, and blood dripped from her knife onto the floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. She looked at Tyvek. "Sorry about the mess, Ambassador," she said, and her voice was hoarse but steady. Behind her, slowly and with the gravity of a mountain bowing to the sky, Warlord Krothar of the Drakari Dominion dropped to one knee. The hall was silent. No one moved, and Tyvek understood, with a clarity that burned like starlight, that everything he thought he knew about humans was wrong. The silence after violence is a strange thing. It is not peaceful. It is the opposite of peaceful. It is the silence of a world that has been broken and has not yet figured out how to put itself back together. And everyone standing in the wreckage of the negotiation hall on Athenium Prime was living inside that silence, while the red emergency lights painted them all the color of blood. 12 Golkari bodies lay on the floor in the positions where they had fallen, massive bone-plated forms that looked like armored statues toppled from their pedestals, and in the center of them stood one human woman who was bleeding and swaying and refusing to sit down. "Captain Voss," Tivik said, and his voice came out thin and strange in his own ears. "You need medical attention." "After," Marin said. "After what?" "After everyone else is accounted for." She turned away from him and began moving through the hall, checking on delegates and guards and staff, with a methodical calm that should have been impossible for someone who had just fought 12 bio-augmented assassins single-handedly, and was currently leaving a trail of her own blood on the floor with every step. She checked the wounded Drakari warriors first, applying pressure to injuries with her bare hands, and directing the station's medical staff when they finally arrived through the shattered doors, and the Drakari let her touch them without protest, which Tivek understood was something that simply did not happen. Drakari warriors did not allow outsiders to tend their wounds, because it implied weakness, and yet not one of them pulled away from her hands. She checked the IF drones next, the ones whose hive link had been scrambled by the nerve disruptors, and she sat with them while they rebooted their connection to each other, clicking and twitching on the floor like broken toys, slowly remembering how to work. And she did not rush them, and she did not leave until the last one had re-established its link and stood up on its own legs. She checked the civilian staff, the translators and aides and administrative workers, who had been hiding behind furniture, and who emerged now with the shattered expressions of people who had just learned what the universe was actually like beneath its polite diplomatic surface. Only after every single person in the hall had been accounted for, and either treated or evacuated, did Marin allow the medical team to look at her shoulder, and even then, she walked to the medbay under her own power, and refused the hovering stretcher that the medics tried to insist upon. Tivek followed her, because he did not know what else to do, and because something fundamental had changed inside him during those 3 minutes of violence, and he needed to understand what it was. On the way to the medbay, something remarkable happened. The surviving Drakari honor guard fell into formation around Marin, not around their own warlord, not around Sub-Commander Ishka, but around the human, and they walked with her in the traditional Drakari escort pattern reserved for warriors of the highest honor, their weapons held at attention, their eyes forward, their silence speaking louder than any words. Marin did not acknowledge this, because Tivek suspected she did not understand what it meant, but Krothar did, and the warlord watched his own guard escorting a human to the medbay with an expression that mixed pain and pride in equal measure. An hour later, with her shoulders sealed and bandaged and her body pumped full of enough stimulants to keep her functional, Marin stood in the station's command center and took control of the situation with a quiet authority that no one questioned. She organized the surviving Drakari and Yith guards into joint security teams, something that should have been diplomatically impossible given that both species were technically on the brink of war with one another, each other, and assigned them to patrol the station in pairs. 1 Drakari and 1 Yith per team, watching each other's backs against any remaining threats. They obeyed her. They obeyed her without hesitation and without consulting their respective delegations. And Tivek realized that what he was witnessing was not authority derived from rank or treaty or political legitimacy, but something much older and much more fundamental. She had bled for them, and she had fought for them, and she had refused to die, and that earned a currency that no diplomatic credential could match. Krothar requested a private meeting with Marin, and Tivek was permitted to attend as a neutral observer, and what happened in that meeting changed the course of the summit and possibly the course of galactic history. The warlord sat across from the human, and for a long time he simply looked at her, his enormous reptilian body still, and his copper eyes burning with something that had been building since the moment he watched her kill the first Golkari. "Among my people," Krothar said, and his voice was different now, quieter, deeper, stripped of the theatrical growl he used in negotiations. "There is a concept called Velfarok. It does not translate well into common speech, but it means something like the dance of the war god, the moment when a warrior transcends the limits of flesh and becomes something that fights with the hand of a divine force. He paused, and the pause was heavy with significance. It has never been given to an outsider in the 4,000-year history of the Drakari Dominion. I am giving it to you now, Captain Voss, and I do so not as a diplomat making a gesture, but as a warrior who has witnessed something sacred. Marin was quiet for a moment, and Tivik watched her face, and saw something he had not expected, not pride, not satisfaction, but a kind of tired sadness that passed across her features like a cloud crossing. The sun, before she pushed it away and replaced it with a simple nod. I accept the honor, Warlord, and I thank you for it. Krothar leaned forward, and what he said next cracked open the summit like an egg. I came here prepared to let this peace fail, he said. There are factions within my fleet and within my government that want war, and I was too proud and too angry to stop them. And I told myself that if the Concord could not produce a mediator strong enough to earn my respect, then the Concord did not deserve to survive. His eyes found Marin's and held them. I was wrong, not because you earned my respect, though you did, but because you showed me something I had forgotten, that strength is not only the ability to destroy, but the willingness to protect, and that the greatest warrior is not the one who kills the most enemies, but the one who stands between the innocent and the darkness and refuses to move. The room was silent, and Tivek felt the hairs on his arms rise, because he understood that he was listening to a Drakari warlord, a being of pure martial pride, whose species had built an empire on the philosophy that might makes right, openly and sincerely reconsidering the foundation of his entire worldview, because a human woman had shown him something his own warriors never could. That evening, the Yith emissary's drone body collapsed. The attack on the station had disrupted the rogue hive node signal, the same node that had been feeding the emissary false instructions and pushing the Yith toward war. And in the absence of that corrupted signal, the true Overmind had reasserted control and immediately recognized the scope of the sabotage within its own network. The Overmind sent a new message through the restored emissary. It expressed regret for the damage caused by the rogue node. It acknowledged that the expansion into Drakari sacred systems had been driven by corrupted directives rather than genuine collective policy, and it agreed to withdraw from the disputed territories. That night, alone in his quarters while the station hummed with repair crews and the quiet murmur of guards who were learning to work together, Tivek did something he had never done in 40 years of diplomatic service. He researched humans. He pulled up the Concord Xenobiological and Historical Database, and he read about Earth, and about the species that had crawled out of its oceans and learned to walk upright, and then spent the next several thousand years perfecting the art of killing each other in every conceivable way. He read about their wars so numerous and so varied that the database had to categorize them by type and era and geography and ideology. And he read about the weapons they had built, weapons that could crack atoms and poison the air and burn cities to ash in the time it took to blink. And then he read about their art and their music and their literature and their medicine and their capacity for love and sacrifice and compassion, and he realized that these were not separate things. The violence and the tenderness were not opposites living in the same species, but two sides of the same coin, inseparable and interdependent. Humans were not peaceful despite their capacity for war. They were peaceful because of it. They had seen what they could do, had done it repeatedly to each other, and they had chosen to be something different, not because they were weak, but because they understood the cost of strength better than any species in the galaxy. He found a human phrase buried in an old Terran military text, and it stayed in his mind like a splinter of light he could not remove. We are the ones who greet you with open hands, and pray you never make us close them into fists. In the medbay, Sub-Commander Ishka found Marin sitting on the edge of a medical bed, her shoulder freshly bandaged, staring at nothing, with the look of someone whose body had stopped moving, but whose mind had not yet caught up. "How did you learn to fight like that?" Ishka asked. Marin looked at the Drakkar woman for a long time before answering. "Everyone on Earth learns two things growing up," she said quietly. "How to love something enough to die for it, and how to be angry enough to kill for it. The hard part is knowing which one you are doing." Ishka sat down beside her, and neither of them spoke again, for a long while. And the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one after the battle. It was the silence of two warriors from different worlds, who understood each other in a way that did not require words. It was not a perfect document. No peace accord ever is. But it was real, and it was binding, and it represented something that had seemed impossible, when Tyvek had first stood at that observation window, and watched two hostile fleets circling each other like predators, deciding who would strike first. The Drakkari Dominion agreed to recognize the Yith Collective's biological need for expansion, while establishing protected zones around systems of cultural and spiritual significance. And the Yith Collective agreed to submit future expansion plans to a joint review council that would include representatives from both species and from the broader Concord. It was messy, and it was complicated, and it would require decades of careful management. But it existed, and 3 weeks ago it had not, and that was enough. On the day the accord was finalized, Warlord Krothar did something that sent shockwaves through the entire Drakkari political structure. He clasped forearms with the Yith emissary in the traditional Drakkari gesture of mutual respect between warriors, and the emissary's drone body returned the gesture with a precision that suggested the Overmind had spent considerable processing power learning how to do it correctly. Tivek watched this happen and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. Hope, the genuine and fragile kind, the kind that knows it can be broken and chooses to exist anyway. When the delegations departed and the fleets outside the station began to withdraw to their respective territories, Tivek was summoned to the Concord High Council to deliver his official report on the summit. He stood before 13 representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species, beings who commanded fleets and economies and civilizations that spanned hundreds of star systems, and he told them what had happened on Athenaeum Prime. He told them about the conspiracy and the Gulkari mercenaries and the rogue Yith hive node, the jammed communications, and they listened with the appropriate expressions of concern and outrage. And then they asked him to assess the human contribution to the resolution of the crisis. Tivek had spent 3 days writing his assessment, and he had rewritten it 4 times because each version felt insufficient. And in the end he abandoned the formal diplomatic language he had spent his career perfecting, and wrote something that was closer to the truth. "The Galactic Concord has made a critical error in its classification of the human species," he said, reading from his report, while the council watched him with varying degrees of attention. "We have categorized them as a minor partner, valued for their engineering skills and their commercial flexibility, but not considered a serious factor in matters of security or strategic importance." He paused and looked up from his document. "This assessment is not merely inaccurate. It is dangerous because it means we have fundamentally misunderstood what humans are." The council stirred, and Tivek continued. "Humans are not warriors in the way the Drakkari are warriors. They do not build their identity around combat or define their worth through conquest. And they are not strategists in the way the Yith are strategists. They do not approach conflict as a mathematical problem to be optimized. Humans are something far more complex and far more dangerous. They are a species that is genuinely and sincerely committed to peace, not as an ideal, but as a practical choice. And the reason they are so good at peace is that they are so terrifyingly effective at war." He let that sentence hang in the air. Every human handshake, Every human smile, every act of human diplomacy and generosity and cooperation is a choice. A conscious and deliberate choice made by a species that carries inside its DNA the memory of 10,000 years of war against itself. Invented nuclear weapons and biological warfare, and industrialized killing on a scale that would make the Dracari pale. And then chose, not was forced, to put those weapons down and build something better. Captain Marin Voss did not fight those 12 Galcari assassins because she is a uniquely talented individual, although she is. She fought them because that is what humans do when the things they have chosen to protect are threatened. And she fought with a combination of adaptability and ferocity, and sheer biological stubbornness that our combat analysts are still struggling to model, because it does not fit into any existing framework. She fought like that, because her species has been fighting like that for its entire existence. Not against alien threats, but against each other, against predators, against their own planet's attempts to kill them, against extinction itself. And they got so good at it that they became the single most dangerous ground combat species in the known galaxy, without anyone noticing because they were too busy being friendly and trading with everyone and fixing our water recyclers. The Council was very quiet now. I recommend that human diplomatic security attachés be assigned to every major Concord summit and negotiation going forward, Tivik said. Not as guards, as deterrents, because the galaxy needs to understand that when a human stands in a room and smiles and offers to shake your hand, that is not weakness. That is a predator choosing to be gentle, and the gentleness is a gift that should not be mistaken for inability. The Council voted unanimously to accept his recommendation, and Tivik noted with dry private amusement that several of the Council members who had previously dismissed humanity as a minor species were now looking at their own human aides and assistants with new and slightly nervous eyes. 2 days later, Tivik received word that Warlord Krothar had returned to Dracari space and done something unprecedented. He had addressed his War Council and advocated openly for diplomacy. The War Council had pushed back, as War Councils always do, and Krothar had silenced them with a story about what he had witnessed on Athenaeum Prime. I watched one human kill 12 of the most dangerous mercenaries in the galaxy, he told them, his voice carrying across the great stone hall of the Dracari Command Citadel. One human, alone, wounded, armed with a pistol and a knife, and she did not just survive, she dominated. She controlled the battle from the first second to the last, and when it was over she was still standing and they were not. He had looked at his generals, and his admirals, and his champions, and he had said the thing that would be quoted in Dracari political texts for centuries afterward. If that is what one of them can do, imagine what happens when they send an army. We will find better enemies, or we will find peace. And those are our only options, because I will not lead this dominion into a war against a species that produces warriors like her the way a river produces water, endlessly and without effort. The War Council had voted for peace by a margin of 9-3, and the 3 who voted against had changed their minds within the month. The Yith Overmind, meanwhile, had conducted a thorough purge of the rogue hive nodes that had been corrupted within its network, and had traced the corruption back to an external influence, a third party that had been manipulating both the Dracari and the Yith toward war for its own purposes, an investigation that was still ongoing, and that Tivek suspected would reveal uncomfortable truths about who really benefited from galactic instability. As a gesture of unprecedented trust, the Overmind sent a formal invitation to the United Terran Commonwealth to embed human advisors within Yith space, the first time any species had been offered such access to the collective's inner workings. The galaxy took notice. Within 6 months, requests for human diplomatic security personnel increased by 400% across Concord space, and the Terran Commonwealth found itself in the unexpected position of being the most sought-after partner for high-stakes negotiations. not because of their fleet size or their economic output, but because every species in the galaxy had now heard the story of what happened on Athenaeum Prime, and none of them wanted to find out what would happen if a human decided they were the enemy. Captain Marin Voss was offered a promotion to Colonel, a Commonwealth Medal of Valor, and a prestigious advisory position on the Terran Diplomatic Council. She declined all three. Her request, submitted through standard military channels, was simple: reassignment to the next volatile summit, wherever it was, whatever the threat level. The Commonwealth granted the request and attached a note to her service file that read, "Asset performs best in impossible conditions. Do not waste on peacetime postings." On the morning she left Athenaeum Prime, Tivek met her at the shuttle bay. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say and had discarded every version because the formal language of diplomacy was not sufficient for what he needed to express. And so in the end he simply said what was true. "I misjudged you, Captain, and I misjudged your species. And I want you to know that I have spent 40 years as a diplomat believing that peace is achieved through words and reason, and the careful management of competing interests. And in 3 minutes, you taught me that peace is also achieved by someone being willing to stand in the doorway and fight so that the people behind them have the chance to keep talking." Marin looked at him and smiled, that same warm human smile that showed teeth without threat, that strange, impossible expression that somehow communicated kindness and danger in equal measure, and she extended her hand. Tivek took it. Her grip was firm but gentle, calibrated perfectly to his species' bone density, just as it had been on the first day they met. And he realized as she shook his hand that even this simple human greeting, was a restrained act by someone who knew exactly how much force she could apply, and was choosing, deliberately and with full awareness, to use only a fraction of it. She let go and picked up her bag, and walked to her shuttle without looking back, because humans did not look back. They looked forward, always forward, toward the next crisis and the next impossible situation, and the next room full of people who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. Tivek stood at the viewport and watched her shuttle shrink into the vast black canvas of space until it was nothing more than a point of light among the stars, indistinguishable from any other, small, ordinary, and easy to overlook, just like the species it carried. He stood there for a long time, thinking about what he had learned, thinking about what it meant for the galaxy, thinking about the strange and terrible and wonderful creatures that had crawled out of a small blue world on the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm, and walked into a universe that had no idea what was coming. And the thought that settled into his mind and stayed there, warm and unsettling in equal measure, was this: the galaxy sleeps peacefully tonight, not because there are no monsters in the dark, but because the humans are standing watch between the monsters and everyone else, smiling their strange soft smiles and offering to shake hands and fix water recyclers and trade stories over drinks. And may whatever gods exist across every world and every species have mercy on anyone foolish enough to give them a reason to stop.